Is Canada Europe's real friend across the Atlantic? Good evening, you're watching On the Record with me, Aaron Darman. When people think of the transatlantic relationship, the first country that comes to mind is the United States of America. But in reality, there's another player in town. Canada has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine and the eastern flank. The country's largest international military operation is based in Latvia, leading a NATO deployment to deter Russian forces. And Prime Minister Mark Carney has promised Kyiv to put troops on the ground once a ceasefire deal is struck. So what's next for Ottawa's ties with Europe? In just a moment, I'll sit down for an exclusive interview with Roland Paris, Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and former Foreign Policy Advisor to ex-Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But first, a short report.
Canada, a vast and resource-rich country proud of its independence and an unexpected power on Europe's eastern flank. Since 2017, Canadian troops have led NATO's mission in Latvia to keep Russia at bay, standing up Ottawa's largest overseas deployment, which has now been renewed for another 3 years. On top of that, billions in aid and years of training have made Canada one of Ukraine's key backers, with Prime Minister Mark Carney heading on a whistle-stop tour to the likes of Riga, Warsaw and Kyiv just last month.
We're investing today $2 billion in new military assistance for Ukraine. $800 million of this will help strengthen Ukraine's arsenal for the most urgently needed defense equipment: drones, ammunition, armored vehicles.
Canada is also home to one of the largest Ukrainian diasporas in the world, more than 1 million people, a community that keeps the war in Ukraine at the centre of national debate and ties Canada even more closely to Europe's security concerns. Those ties received an unexpected boost earlier this year after comments made by Washington's new sheriff in town, Donald Trump.
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state.
Proud Canadians made it clear that joining the United States was not on the table.
It's not for sale, won't be for sale, ever.
In Europe, politicians rushed to Canada's defence, half-jokingly suggesting that the country was even more European than some EU member states, and that if integration was ever considered, the European Union would be the more natural home. The idea sparked a reminder of how deep Canada's ties to Europe already are. Economically, the relationship is anchored in the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement signed in 2016. It eliminates tariffs on 98% of goods, has boosted two-way trade to more than 90 billion euros annually, and made the EU Canada's largest trading partner after the United States. Despite formally sitting outside the EU, Canada already acts as one of Europe's closest partners, separated by the Atlantic, but deeply connected to the continent's future.
And joining me now from Ottawa is Professor Roland Paris. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Before we zero in on Canada, I do want to start with the news breaking out of Poland in the past 24 hours, this alleged Russian drone incursion into Polish airspace. What does this tell us about Russia's intent beyond Ukraine?
Well, I think it just underscores what we already knew, which is that Russia poses a risk to the entire eastern flank of NATO. That's certainly how it's perceived by many people here in Canada. As you mentioned in your intro piece, Canada is the framework nation leading the multinational NATO battalion in Latvia. So this is a matter of great concern in Canada. It's alarming to see these drones entering Poland, and it should be a matter of great concern to everyone.
Is it confirmation that Russia is already waging a war with the West, with Europe, with Canada, even America?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily confirmation of Russia going to war with NATO. I mean, a lot of the details remain to be seen, but certainly Russia sees the Ukraine, its invasion of Ukraine, as a counter to NATO, which it asserts is the real enemy. And in Poland and in many other countries, Russia has been engaging in various types of activities, which have been seeking to undermine domestic politics and to weaken the cohesion of the NATO alliance. So in that sense, Russia is very much trying to weaken NATO and kind of in a shadow war with NATO right now.
So there is some kind of a war, some kind of a conflict going on, but we're not yet at a point where we would say that it's an all-out military conflict that we would regard as a military conflict with NATO.
Well, I think that's right, at least as things stand at this moment. We don't yet really know what the story is behind these drones. It could have been that Russia is testing the response of NATO just to see what the political response is of the NATO alliance, of the United States. It is conceivable that these drones, that there's some other explanation for these drones, but there were a lot of them over a prolonged period, which suggests that this was deliberate intent.
You raise a really good point there, NATO's response. Poland has now asked for Article 4, which means basically talk consultation, to be invoked. That would be the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or full-scale invasion rather. Does NATO, though, at some point finally need to say that Article 5 needs to be invoked, that an attack on one is an attack on all? Or is this Article 4, would that be a logical step?
Well, it's the consultation mechanism, and I think that it completely makes sense to invoke Article 4 right now. You know, the issue about when Article 5 comes into effect is a really vexing one, because as we saw in 2014, when Russia first had its unrecognized little green men appear in Ukraine, the Russians are very good at this kind of initiating situations that might fall underneath the threshold of an overt invasion, which is what Article 5 is in effect intended to respond to. So this will be an ongoing challenge for NATO. And the way to respond to this is to make sure that NATO is really prepared to respond effectively in the event of a unmistakable Russian incursion into NATO territory.
You were Justin Trudeau's former foreign policy advisor. When this type of event happens on the eastern flank, given Canada's involvement on the eastern flank, what would your advice be in this situation?
Well, my advice, and I would assume that Mark Carney, the current Prime Minister, is getting the same advice, is to express solidarity with Poland. He was just in Poland. He negotiated and signed a strategic partnership agreement between Canada and Poland, including economic elements and security elements, would be to express solidarity with Poland and with NATO, and to express Canada's alarm at this incursion of Polish sovereignty and of NATO territory, and to engage in the discussions in Brussels, analyzing what the source of this incursion was. And I think that it's also part of a much larger momentum that's taking place, not just in Europe, but in Canada too, which is one that's aimed at preparing NATO to be capable of withstanding Russian aggression if it should come in the future in different forms. And Canada has recently announced that, like other NATO countries, it will increase its defense spending to 5%, and it's going to cooperate with Europe in some of that defense investment, and with Poland, which was part of this, the strategic agreement with Poland. So I think that this is just another reminder that the world has changed, that we have to, in order to ensure peace in Europe, we have to prepare to be able to actively and effectively resist Russia. And I think that that's the direction that we're heading in.
So let's talk about Canada on the eastern flank, especially the country's largest overseas military operation in Latvia, which many might see as an unexpected show of force from a country so far away geographically, 2,000 troops on the ground. What drives Canada's political will to defend Europe from Russia's threats?
Well, Canada has incredibly long historic ties to Europe. In a sense, if in addition to the indigenous people who lived here when Europeans first arrived, the first settlers here were from France and England. And the traditions of those countries really shaped the development of Canada as a nation. But beyond that, among Canada's closest friends in the world are the democracies of Europe in a world that's increasingly unfriendly. And NATO has always been very central to Canada's foreign policy. There's not a lot of debate in this country about NATO. There's general support and acceptance of our connection with NATO. And I think a recognition that, as we learned in the 20th century, at great cost, that Canada has a real interest in helping to ensure that Europe remains stable and secure.
Operation Reassurance, which is the Latvia deployment, has recently been renewed again for another 3 years until 2029. Given the history, do you see Canada having a longer-term future in this region here, the eastern flank?
I do, and it's interesting because at the end of the Cold War, Canada withdrew its permanent deployment of Canadian forces that were then based in what was then West Germany. And this Latvia deployment really represents, I think, a return for the long term of Canadian forces to Europe, and particularly to the eastern flank. And right now, Canada's military capabilities continue to be somewhat limited, but they're rapidly increasing. The current government of Mark Carney has set a path to a really dramatic increase in defense spending in this country, in Canada. And so the capacity to sustain these deployments in Europe, I think, will only grow over time. And I see in the Canadian public, for now at least, a recognition of the importance of our participation in these deterrence efforts in Europe. And I think that will continue. I don't see it ending anytime soon.
You mentioned members of the public there. I think it's a really interesting discussion because when it comes to the NATO summit and even the lifting of defence to GDP, that 5% target, you have countries like Spain, given their distance away from the eastern flank, internal politics playing a really big role to ensure that a country like that says, no, we don't want to reach that target, or at least we need to have some kind of a staged mechanism. Is there that support within Canada that even though the eastern flank is so far away across the Atlantic and across the whole continent, that there is a sense among Canadian people that they need to do their part?
Well, this comes through in a few different ways. So if you look at public opinion polls, there are various polls that ask people in different countries that are members of NATO whether have favorable or unfavorable attitudes towards NATO. And in Canada, the favorability ratings are extremely high, about 70%, which is up there with a few other NATO member countries, including the UK. 70% is higher than the favorability of NATO in France, certainly much higher than in places like Spain. So there you get a little flavor of it. But I think another indication is that we just had an election campaign. We had an election campaign a couple of years before that. And at no point in those campaigns was Canada's deployment in Latvia a issue that became a matter of debate between competing parties. So for the time being, at least, this is just broadly accepted in Canada. We have limited military capabilities because we have not invested in our military for a long time since the end of the Cold War. Our support for Ukraine has been really extensive financially, per capita basis, more than any other G7 country. But that military capability from Canada will be growing in the coming years, and it's going to be in cooperation with European countries, including Poland.
What do you make then of the fact that just across the border in the United States of America, there's certainly not that completely, shall we say, unfettered love and support of the NATO alliance, and indeed even the idea that Polish troops, rather American troops, on one hand, yes, they'll stay in Poland. There could be even more. On the other hand, actually, we might cut some funding for American troops along the eastern flank. What do you make of the fact that just across the border, there's this discussion happening, despite in Ottawa, in Canada, there being very much a supportive stance?
Well, the two different countries and two different political cultures. You know, the poll that I was mentioning, and there are many of these polls, they not just ask people, they don't just give you the results for the population as a whole, like 70% of Canadians have a favorable attitude towards NATO. It also breaks it down by which party you support within your own country. And there's not much difference in Canada whether you support one party or another in Canada, whether you're favorable towards NATO. But in the United States, there's a dramatic difference with Republicans now, people who support the Republican Party expressing much more skepticism towards NATO, whereas support for NATO is very high still among those who support the Democratic Party. And this is a reflection of the remarkable polarization in the United States and the upending of decades of foreign policy orthodoxy in that country that is a matter of obvious concern to every other member of NATO. We don't know how the United States will ultimately land, for the time being at least, even though Donald Trump has reportedly mused about withdrawing from NATO in his first term in office. He's never come close to doing that. So maybe this is part of what Russia's trying to test with drones, just to see what the reaction of the United States is to an incursion into Polish airspace. Who knows? But it is disturbing to see what has happened in the United States, although I'm hopeful that smarter heads will prevail there as well.
Precisely what I was going to ask you next. I mean, if we come back to what we were talking about at the top of the show, could this incursion into Polish airspace with drones from Russia be Putin testing Donald Trump?
Well, it's all speculation at this point. We have absolutely no idea what the circumstances were behind these the drones attacks. At least I have no information relating to that, and therefore not even a clue about motivation. But we could speculate that if this was an attempt to test the waters by Vladimir Putin, then part of the testing is just to see how Donald Trump reacts to a nudge directly against a member of NATO. On the other hand, the circumstances could have been quite different, but we will learn something in the coming hours about Donald Trump based on how he responds to this.
We certainly will. On Canada's ties with Brussels, Prime Minister Mark Carney, he says Canada is the most European of non-European countries. Is he right? I mean, is your country the real friend of Europe, the reliable friend, not the United States?
I would say that Canada, I hate to say it, but I think it's true that Canada is a more reliable partner of Europe than the United States. That hasn't always been the case, but I think it is now. And that's unfortunate, for a lot of reasons, because Canada wants the United States to treat its allies like allies, to treat its traditional friends like friends. The United States hasn't turned everything upside down, but it's this the kinds of tactics that the Trump administration has been using against its own allies is not conducive to the kind of trust that we've had in those relationships before. So we would like the relationship, we would like the United States to be a steadfast ally of Europe. We certainly are, and that relationship is only getting closer. Canada recently negotiated an agreement to coordinate with Europe in the investments in defense going forward. I would expect that to bear fruit. As your intro piece mentioned, there is the comprehensive economic agreement between Canada and the European Union. Canada is a strategic partner of Europe. I think that Canadians look to Europe as a set of important friends in a really increasingly unstable world. So I would expect that relationship to get even closer.
And that brings me to the next question. I mean, once upon a time, this seemed extremely far-fetched, but is there a future where Canada could in some way be part of the European Union? Perhaps not as a full member, perhaps as an associate, or in some form? Or are we talking about some kind of a political fantasy?
Well, I think the relationship is going to get closer no matter what. Now, the formal membership process is incredibly complicated, and there would be difficulties there, I'm sure. First of all, it requires unanimous consent in Europe. Second, Canada is not a European country. And third, there would be some concerns here about necessarily making sure that Canada can continue to be interoperable with the United States, which is continues to be our major trading partner, and with other parts of the world. But I don't think that you need to have full membership in the European Union in order to be able to develop an even closer relationship. And we're seeing that happen in a number of different areas. In terms of industrial cooperation, in terms of innovation policy. If you think about energy and Canada's reliable supplies of energy, critical minerals, the same thing. This is part of a discussion between Canada and Europe right now. Even with between Canada and Poland, part of that strategic partnership discussion included the idea of civilian nuclear technology cooperation. So there is a huge amount of additional cooperation, and I think it serves both Europe's and Canada's interest to really deepen it. We want to be able to diversify our economic partnerships because we're so dramatically dependent on the United States, but we also want to strengthen our partnerships with countries that are truly reliable. And I think that Europe has an interest in building the partnership with Canada for precisely the same reasons.
So very briefly, expect the ties to get closer, but this talk of membership of the European Union we probably wouldn't see anytime soon.
I think that's probably right.
Lastly then, while I have you, we're well over 6 months into a Trump presidency next door. 5 months into, a few months rather, into a new Liberal government in Canada. How are those American-Canadian ties sitting at the moment? You saw in the piece at the beginning of the show where Donald Trump talking about absorbing Canada as a 51st state. What is the state of play over where you are?
Well, he has not been using that line very much more recently, talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. That really angered Canadians in a remarkable way earlier this year. And now really things have settled down a bit, but of course, there are serious issues, particularly economic issues, just like every other trading partner of the United States. Canada has been scrambling to try to secure exemptions from tariffs or to reduce American tariffs on Canadian goods. Right now, about 85% of Canada's exports to the United States go tariff-free because they still fall under the North American trade agreement. But there are some sectors that have been targeted by U.S. tariffs that are particularly painful for the Canadian economy, including our steel and aluminum sectors and our auto parts sector and our lumber sector. So there is active negotiation to try and resolve those issues. But I think more broadly, there's a recognition of two things. One is that the United States will continue to be Canada's indispensable economic and security partner. We're going to work with the United States and try and work through these issues no matter what. But secondly, that the United States, it has changed. It's not going to go back to the kind of free trading United States of the past. And therefore, we need to adjust. We need to adjust our own economy, and we need to actively pursue deeper economic partnerships with partners beyond North America. And that's why Europe is such an appealing potential deeper partner for Canada right now.
Roland Paris, Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and former advisor to ex-Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And that's all for On the Record this week. Do stay with us on TVP World. Adam Yasser will be back next week. I'm Aaron Darman. Goodbye for now.